The following presentation was made possible by the Arthur and Helen Baer Foundation, Enterprise Rent-A-Car, Mary Strauss, and the St. Louis Convention and Visitors Commission. For more information about visiting St. Louis, visit exploreStLouis.com. Additional support provided by the Missouri Historical Society, the St. Louis Mercantile Library, and Western Historical Manuscript Collection at the University of Missouri, St. Louis, and the St. Louis Post-Dispatch.
It was a dream to travel west into newly acquired lands, lands that promised a new home and freedom beyond imagination. America was young, the West undiscovered, and the city of St. Louis, on the banks of the Mississippi, represented the end of civilization to a young nation. It was there that travelers going west gathered their supplies and their courage to venture into a vast, unknown territory.
There were a lot of Americans who had tremendous ambitions about what they could do if they moved west.
A lot of the people who did this had never had much of a chance before.
You see in their faces a sense of hard work, but also a certain sense of victory. They have accomplished something. They have moved on. They've gone someplace that no one has ever been before.
Millions would seek freedom and fortune in the West, but not without a price. In the process, they would hunt the beaver and buffalo to near extinction and force out the original inhabitants of the land, the Native Americans. The story of westward expansion and the role St. Louis played in it might have been forgotten, if not for the determination of a soft-spoken man and the hand of a gifted immigrant.
This decision to make a great American monument with an immigrant is perfectly American.
Some said the monument would fall, that their vision was simply too great, that lives would be lost in the attempt. They were wrong.
There were many people who were saying, I don't know how you're going to make that thing work. But I don't think any of the men that were working on that project ever thought that it would be a failure.
It took the vision and determination of so many to create one of the great symbols of America. This is the story of the people it represents and how it came to be. The United States of America was barely 27 years old when President Thomas Jefferson pulled off the biggest land deal in history, doubling the size of his young nation. In 1803, Jefferson gave Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte of France $15 million for more than 500 million acres west of the Mississippi River. Jefferson's enemies said he had wasted money the country did not have for land it did not need. But he believed that the territory known as Louisiana was crucial to his long-time dream of providing room for his country to grow.
The amount of square miles being offered to the country were huge, and he thought that we would create an empire of liberty that would last 1,000 years.
Jefferson, of course, had very noble notions about who we were and what we could be. He felt that we should take the best of European and Western civilization and build upon it in this great democracy. And to do that, we needed room to grow and to expand.
The vast territory Jefferson had bought at about 3 cents an acre was a seemingly unlimited expanse of mountains, prairies, forests, and rivers teeming with wildlife. The president asked his personal secretary, Meriwether Lewis, to lead an expedition to explore the Missouri River and its tributaries, which drained the northern portion of the Louisiana Purchase.
We shall delineate with correctness the great arteries of this great country. Those who come after us will fill up the canvas we begin. Thomas Jefferson.
Lewis chose his good friend William Clark as second in command. And on the afternoon of May 14, 1804, the Corps of Discovery started out from just west of St. Louis, sailing, rowing, paddling, and towing their heavily laden boats westward up the Missouri River to the headwaters more than 2,000 miles away.
Lewis and Clark didn't really know what they were going to find. I mean, it really was a voyage of discovery.
What they don't know, I think, are the surprising differences in the geography and geology of the place.
It was a very rugged trip, and it took very strong, determined men with disciplined leaders to get them through it.
After 2.5 years, covering more than 6,000 miles, the explorers returned to St. Louis, much to the surprise and delight of the residents, who had long ago given them up for lost.
About 12 o'clock, we arrived in sight of St. Louis. Fired 3 rounds as we approached the town. The people gathered on the shore, and hizarad 3 cheers. Then the party, all considerable, much rejoiced that we had the expedition completed. John Ordway, Corps of Discovery.
Lewis and Clark had opened the way west for countless others who would travel over the same hallowed ground on which those men rejoiced and through the city that welcomed them.
The first time I ever saw St. Louis, I could have bought it for $6 million. And it was the mistake of my life that I did not do it. Mark Twain.
Word spread like wildfire about the possibilities of the Western Territory, and soon it seemed the whole country was flocking to St. Louis.
They go in almost every conceivable way. They go by steamboat, they go by canoe, they go on foot.
Ideally, if they had their choice, they would have taken a steamboat. By the 1830s, steamboats were really revolutionizing the way Americans traveled.
Steamboats were ranked 3 deep for more than a mile along the levee. Here, pioneers would pause to stock up on supplies and taste the rich and intoxicating fruits of civilization before heading into the parched unknown.
When they arrived in St. Louis, they would try to gather all of the information they needed, all the supplies they needed, all the contacts they needed.
They have to buy stoves, they have to buy plows, they have to buy wagons. Everything that they're going to take with them has to come from somewhere. They're buying it in St. Louis, making St. Louis an enormous place because it's the outfitter to the west. And every immigrant who wants to head west has to come through St. Louis eventually.
Last spring, 1846, was a busy season in the city of St. Louis. The hotels were crowded, and the gunsmiths and saddlers were kept constantly at work in providing arms and equipment for the different parties of travelers. Almost every day, steamboats were leaving the levee and passing up the Missouri, crowded with passengers on their way to the frontier. Emigrant and author Francis Parkman.
Its boosters proclaimed it the next great city of the world, the new London or Paris or New York. Some had even loftier ideas, suggesting the country might best be served by moving the capital from Washington, D.C. to the more centrally located St. Louis.
People were making lots and lots of money, and they were making it very quickly, especially if they were in the business of outfitting all these people who were headed west.
It leads people to think that St. Louis is going to be the most important city of the United States. It leads people to think whoever controls St. Louis is going to control the West.
The United States was in the process of peopling a continent, and St. Louis was at the heart of it all.
People are coming to St. Louis from all over the world.
It was an intermix of cultures. You could hear all sorts of foreign languages. It was very, very colorful.
I think when people were arriving in St. Louis, it must have been a remarkable experience for them, and maybe the last exciting experience they were going to have in terms of people for quite a while. You can only imagine the kind of hodgepodge of people who had come together at this point, from fur trappers and traders to steamboat captains to Indians to the settlers who were going out to stake their claims out in the Midwest. You can only imagine all the horses and the wagons and white-eyed children and everybody converging here, and the kind of optimism and the interest and the excitement, because these are the people who were going to go from here and they were going to settle the rest of this great country.
It was part of not only American culture, but European culture to be somewhat oblivious to the impact that their culture makes on other people.
To many of the white settlers who went to Western North America and displaced the Indian settlers who were there, they were convinced that America was a land of opportunity. And they were right, that their opportunities were there. They had greater freedoms, greater possibilities, greater opportunities than they believed existed anywhere else in the world. But their freedom and opportunity came as a direct result of the loss of freedom and opportunity by other people.
I am an old woman now. The buffaloes and black-tailed deer are gone, and our Indian ways are almost gone. Sometimes at evening I sit looking out on the big Missouri, and in the river's roar I hear the yells of the warriors and the laughter of the children of old, and tears come into my eyes. Our Indian life, I know, is gone forever. Buffalo Bird Woman.
Pioneers moved west for a variety of reasons. Some in search of riches, others simply to escape poverty. Some were fleeing the law, others were fleeing oppression. What they all shared was the ability to dream of something different, something better, and the West represented an opportunity for that dream to become a reality.
These were people that packed everything they had into the back of a wagon and went. And they went on faith in themselves, in their God, in their new country. And they just went out knowing that they could do this.
Well, I think they went west for so many different reasons, but certainly among them would be the belief that you were going to not only have this new life, which you were freer, but you were going to change yourself. You were going to be a new person in the new world. And this dream that you were going to be transformed may have been just a dream, but it certainly motivated a lot of people. And every time they moved west, they were moving to the future and into a new time and leaving the old time behind.
It must have taken an enormous amount of courage, although probably some of them felt that they didn't have anything and so there was nothing to lose as they moved west. And it speaks to the human capacity to take risks and to go forward and to build in spite of all sorts of terrors, real and imagined.
Cautiously, I slipped from under the buffalo hide, got up on my knees and peered over the side of the wagon. There was nothing but land, not a country at all, but the material out of which countries are made. I had the feeling that the world was left behind, and we had got over the edge of it and were outside man's jurisdiction. Willa Cather.
Soon, America would be settled from the Atlantic to the Pacific, from the Canadian border to the Gulf of Mexico. Thomas Jefferson estimated it would take 1,000 years to settle the West. It took less than 100.
And St. Louis was at the beginning of that West. That's where people could mill about and overhear conversations about somebody else's dream and sort of catch the excitement of that. No doubt about the future. The future was clear. It was West. And St. Louis was where that happened.
While St. Louis basked in the glow of the nation's spotlight, standing in the wings was a young upstart to the north, Chicago.
People came to St. Louis because it was a city of rivers from which they could travel to points further west, further south, or further east by the 1850s, people were traveling by railroad, and Chicago was this railroad center that completely eclipsed St. Louis.
With the driving of a golden spike near Promontory Point, Utah in 1869, rails ran from Chicago to the West Coast. Transportation and St. Louis would be changed forever.
You would think that the 1930s would be the worst time to plan a monument because as a result of the Great Depression, there were a tremendous number of Americans out of work. The federal government really wasn't bringing in tax revenue, and it would seem like a crazy thing to do.
But I think at the same time there's a creativity there, and there's not a belief that just because we're poor we can't do anything. And I think it's a time that people still thought big and planned big and thought that things were possible to get done.
By the 1930s, it was obvious that a once shining St. Louis was in decline. The Great Depression had devastated the United States and had hit St. Louis particularly hard. Almost 1 in 4 St. Louisans were unemployed.
In the 1930s, St. Louis was just trying to emerge from the Depression.
It was decaying. It lost a lot of its energy. I think there was a lot of fears for its future. People are depressed. People are down. The unemployment rate in St. Louis in the 1930s is enormous.
And I think St. Louisans were starting to doubt themselves. The air was heavily polluted with homes burning coal that produced days that were just known as black days, when the entire city was covered with just this thick, acrid smoke.
St. Louis feels like it's on the decline, that something's got to be done to revitalize it.
The waterfront that once pulsed with life was now a dark labyrinth of dirty, decaying, and for the most part, abandoned buildings.
The riverfront was dirty, smoky, and people were moving away from the river. They didn't want to live down there anymore. They wanted to live out in the country.
You did not have a waterfront that was an attraction to St. Louis. You could argue it was a distraction.
The river and the riverfront had kind of been left to die. You know, the riverboat days were done.
And there was a strong feeling that the older parts of the city needed to be cleared and rebuilt.
It was this dreary sight that a prominent St. Louis lawyer, Luther Ely Smith, saw with new eyes as he returned from a trip during the middle of the Depression in 1933. He looked out of the train window, no doubt saddened by what St. Louis had become. As the train crept past those faded remembrances of old St. Louis, Smith realized something needed to be done, and he was the man to do it. On that fateful train trip, Luther Smith happened to be coming home from the dedication of a memorial to George Rogers Clark in Vincennes, Indiana. He wondered why the same sort of thing couldn't be done in St. Louis, giving the city a much-needed makeover.
My grandfather was very aware that St. Louis was sort of past its glory days of westward expansion. And to develop the riverfront and build a monument would perhaps brighten things up.
He wasn't looking to make a name for himself, but he really thought this was something that St. Louis needed, that America needed. And he was the kind of guy that could just pull the right people together and say, we need to do this, how do we go about doing it?
Smith felt Thomas Jefferson was one of the most popular presidents, and he believed that St. Louis had a good shot at getting federal money for a monument to honor him. And there was something else on Smith's mind. The country had forgotten the critical role St. Louis had played in westward expansion. He imagined a monument not only to the city, but to the fur traders, the pioneers, the people who expanded America's boundaries. Smith enlisted the help of St. Louis Mayor Bernard Dickman. Getting other civic leaders involved, however, sometimes required some creative arm bending.
It was difficult often to get the attention of other St. Louis civic leaders. There were many important projects going on. If he got no as an answer to a lunch invitation, he again was persistent and invited them to breakfast at the house.
Smith and the other civic leaders formed the Jefferson National Expansion Memorial Association to create a national memorial along the banks of the Mississippi. It seemed like the project was well on its way. Luther Ely Smith had no way of knowing that he would spend the rest of his life struggling to get the memorial built. A project this large would require a good amount of financial support, both locally and nationally. So Smith's next step was to approach the citizens of St. Louis for money to get the project going.
Which meant, in the height of the Depression, Smith and the mayor were asking the people of St. Louis to approve a bond issue of, I believe, $7.5 million, which during the Depression was real money, and asking a city that was just trying to get back on its feet to make this kind of expenditure was very daring.
St. Louisans overwhelmingly passed the bond issue, and Smith expected that in due time, the Jefferson Memorial would be built.
He had no idea what he was undertaking in terms of the cost and the time that it would take.
Smith and Mayor Dickman had thought that federal money would also be made available for the project. When they found out differently, Dickman traveled to Washington, D.C. with a message for FDR.
Dickman said, "I just don't think that I can guarantee any Democratic votes for Roosevelt in '36 in eastern Missouri," and said, you know, we better do something about finding a way to create this memorial on the St. Louis riverfront.
Shortly after that visit, federal money for the project was made available. In 1936, the National Park Service began acquiring property in a 40-block area on the west bank of the Mississippi and tearing down the buildings to make way for a future memorial, yet to be designed. But when World War II began, work on the project stopped.
When World War II was over, the United States was kind of left standing with all of the other countries in Europe impoverished, with many of their cities badly bombed, because the United States entered rather late and played a major role and was there when victory took place. The United States ended up, after World War II, sort of the world economic and military power. And that affected the American psyche.
America viewed its place in the post-war world with both optimism and confidence. The country was on the move again, and so too was work on the Jefferson National Expansion Memorial.
There was an enormous amount of optimism about our country and about what we could be and how we could express in art and architecture this sense of forward motion.
And remember, this is a time when people are learning to make bigger and faster airplanes, when technology had advanced a lot because of World War II, and there was this tremendous enthusiasm and optimism and belief.
The largest architectural competition of the time was held to determine precisely what form the memorial would take. Entries were submitted by some of the greatest architects in the world, lured by the biggest cash prize ever awarded and the opportunity to create a national symbol.
So any architect, any of the 172 architects who submitted designs to this competition, you know, we're really thirsting to win this competition because this is just, you know, a huge, huge project.
They asked one of the most respected architects in the country, George Howe, to serve as the professional advisor for the competition. By doing that, they made certain that the jury would look for a great work of art and architecture rather than a purely practical structure. The design competition, which was open to anyone who, by education or experience, considered himself an architect, attracted most of the important architects of the time, including a well-known Finnish architect named Ailill Saarinen. His son, Aaro, a brash young architect eager for his own level of success, decided to enter the competition separately. Eliel Saarinen was already a famous architect when Eero was born at the family home outside Helsinki, Finland in 1910.
My father grew up underneath my grandfather's drafting table, and the whole family was involved with design and architecture from a very early age.
He could go to school, he could have a regular life with the rest of the kids, and then he could come home from school and he could work with his father designing buildings. He was a regular kid, and yet after school he could come home and already be sort of a junior architect.
He would work in the studio with my grandfather and the other designers and pepper them with questions about this aspect of geometry or that aspect, or how did you do this, or how could I do that?
In 1923, Eliel entered a design competition for the Chicago Tribune Tower.
Even though he'd never even seen a skyscraper, or he'd never really seen a city with skyscrapers, he came in second. And with that came a monetary prize, and so he came to America to see if maybe there could be work here.
Eero Saarinen was 12 when his father moved the family to the United States. Eero would go on to study sculpture in Paris and architecture at Yale, completing the 4-year program in just 3 years. When Eero returned from college, there was a place for him in his father's architectural firm, and at the art institute his father helped establish, called Cranbrook. Cranbrook was a sort of creative think tank. There, a group of talented young architects, artists, and designers had been attracted by Eliel's gift for teaching. His son Eero blossomed in the creative community of Cranbrook. It was an opportunity to try out new ideas while continuing to absorb his father's considerable experience.
So Saarinen had an incredible background, but of course, he was a foreigner. He came carrying many ideas that were new to this country, and it was not easy for him to introduce these ideas, which included, by the way, getting away from just the strict orthogonal right-angle geometries, creating curves, creating free forms, creating something that is almost aerodynamic and poetic in its sense, whether it was a building, a chair, or a functional item.
In 1947, Eero traveled to New Hampshire to toss around an idea for the monument with his longtime friend and renowned landscape architect Dan Kiley. Saarinen had come up with the idea of an arch by shaping pipe cleaners on his living room floor. Now he and Kiley would use the secluded atmosphere of Kiley's office in the family barn to flesh out the idea.
Imagine yourself sitting in a barn trying to figure out how to create a monument to westward expansion. And that's the place where you're going to work, and this is where you're going to imagine all of the possibilities and solve all the problems. If you're focused on what it is you're trying to create, the barn disappears and the possibilities appear everywhere. And that was part of the reason why it seems so amazing today that they were doing something so futuristic, if you will, at that time under more primitive circumstances, except that imagination is not a primitive tool. It's a wildly wonderful tool that everybody has if they learn to use it.
In addition to Dan Kiley, Saarinen would need to put together a strong and diverse team to work on his entry. The team would include his wife, sculptor Lily Swan Saarinen, designer Alexander Girard, and architect and illustrator J. Henderson Barr. Eero would draw upon the collaborative atmosphere he had experienced at Cranbrook to create a free-flowing exchange of ideas within the team.
When you're in a very creative, highly charged atmosphere, you just explore any possibility. And that's where they were in their minds. That's what they were doing when they had this competition to work on. Anything goes.
They said this whole thing is about a concept, an idea, a symbol that we are going to have to create. If we're going to rank with the great memorials that have been created already in history, This memorial has got to be something that's larger than life.
Everybody would sort of think about ideas, kind of brainstorm about ideas, and everybody would draw, and everybody would make sketches. And Arrow himself would make lots and lots of sketches. And then they would lay them all out, and then Arrow would look at them all, and he'd pick one, or he'd pick two, or pick three. And then they would go back, and more people would draw it some more.
With both father and son entering the competition, the Saarinen architectural firm was a whirlwind of activity. While Arrow's team worked on one side of the office, his father Eliel's team worked on the other, separated only by a partition.
And all of the partitions were glass. So they covered the middle partition with paper all the way down, and Eliel worked on this side and Arrow worked on this side.
The memorial competition took place in 2 stages. The first stage would narrow down the entries to 5 finalists. Then in the second stage, those finalists would be asked essentially to fine-tune their designs. In September 1947, the competition finalists were notified by telegram. When one arrived addressed simply to Mr. Saarinen, everyone naturally assumed that it was the elder and more seasoned architect of the family, Eliel, who had been selected as a finalist. But it was not Eliel's concept that had caught the jurors' eyes. It was the bold new design from his son, Arrow. The Arrow Saarinen team's entry was the only one with a single memorable, breathtaking centerpiece. A huge, majestic steel arch rising out of the landscape at the water's edge.
What Saarinen presented could not have been in the mind of any of the judges before they started.
A geometric form like that, I think, represented a new vision of the world, a more idealistic, and maybe utopian even, vision of what the world would be in the future.
His design immediately sent a monumental scale and form that just totally made all the other submissions seem like, nothing.
It looked like nothing anyone had seen before and would absolutely dominate the cityscape. Saarinen's entry was so impressive that the second round of the competition was perhaps a mere formality. And in February of 1948, the design that started with a series of pipe cleaners and a brainstorming session in a barn was selected as the official winner for the competition. Luther Ely Smith may have been the person most excited about Saarinen's design, for now the dream that he'd been working on for nearly 15 years finally had a form.
We are still breathless at the vision you have opened up for us by your marvelously fine design. The more we gaze upon it, the more wonderful and gripping it grows. We congratulate ourselves and the nation on the good fortune that is ours. Luther Ely Smith.
Arrow Saarinen called his winning entry the Gateway to the West, and from that point forward, that phrase would forever be synonymous with the city of St. Louis.
The jury definitely had to put a huge trust and believe that this was not just a hollow set of drawings, that this was not just sort of a figment of an architect's imagination, but that there was substance behind it.
Building a 630-foot tall concrete and stainless steel building like that had never been done in 1948. This was really just when the first modern skyscrapers, the first all-glass skyscrapers were being built.
There was no caveat in the competition booklet that says, oh, by the way, anything you design, you have to know how to build it. It was just, I mean, that's the way competition was held, you know? You just went about and you designed something, and then you had to leave it later for the engineers to figure out actually how to build it.
Saarinen's winning design would initiate the most ambitious engineering and construction project of its time.
Certainly, Arrow Saarinen was pushing the boundaries of technology.
Saarinen was always pushing the envelope. I mean, I think that was the culture at that time in design.
We loved the idea of not just artistic innovation, but technological innovation.
In the years that followed the competition, Saarinen and his team continued to tweak his design.
There was a kind of constant negotiation and a constant refinement.
My father spent a lot of time exploring models and lots of different forms of the same idea, and spent months refining and refining.
He wanted to get the perfect curve to this memorial.
Saarinen had started with a basic geometric form and then subtly refined it, sculpted it to be more impressive, more powerful, more awe-inspiring. Saarinen would change the height of the arch from 590 feet to 630 feet, thus ensuring that it would be our nation's tallest monument and tower over the other buildings of the time. While Saarinen's innovative design was embraced by most people, it would become an easy target for others who saw no value in the monument.
It was a political football. It was so easy for a congressman to get a little press by saying, oh, let's not do that thing, it's art. You know, it's useless.
It was compared to a fascist symbol, challenged by lawmakers and heatedly debated on editorial pages.
I don't think any of us are being helpful by telling the government that they must stick to a formula which includes a futuristic arch that will be of no earthly use to our people. The argument that it will become a trademark for St. Louis and a landmark for generations of the future is a rather empty one to me. Fred M. Sy, Jr.
Saarinen described his monument as a triangular ribbon of beauty and permanence floating in the air. Figuring out exactly how to build this ribbon of steel would become the job of an internationally recognized design engineer, Fred Severud. Severud and his team would rely on an innovative construction technique to build the monument.
They were very influenced by some experimental engineering that had cropped up in the 1950s, a type of engineering called orthotropic design.
This new type of engineering allowed the arch to be built without using an internal steel skeleton. The outside walls would support it. Orthotropic design allowed room inside the structure for an observation area and room within the legs of the arch to transport visitors to it. The task of creating a way to get people to the top of the arch fell to Dick Bowser, a college dropout with a background in making elevators for parking garages. Bowser spent 2 weeks devising the plan in his basement. He considered the use of escalators, a series of elevators, and even a Ferris wheel type approach.
He came up with the idea of having a very small capsule that would fit at the top of the arch and could carry people all the way down to the bottom.
Bowser was invited to meet with Saarinen to describe his idea.
And it turns out he walks into the room and there's about 50 people in the room, including the mayor of St. Louis and the director of the Park Service and all these real bigwigs, politicians or their representatives. And here's, Dick Bowser, who's really this nobody that's just worked in elevators, but he has to come into this room and he has to convince all of these high-powered people that the concept that he's come up with in 2 weeks in his basement is the one that they should use in their arch.
Bowser's ingenious design was the perfect solution. On the morning of June 23, 1959, a cluster of St. Louis businessmen and civic leaders gathered on the high ground near the levee of the Mississippi, trying to imagine what would become a great American symbol. After more than 30 years of struggling, St. Louis Mayor Raymond Tucker turned up the first bit of dirt, and with the turning of his shovel, set in motion a monumental construction project, the building of the Gateway Arch. 300,000 cubic feet of earth and rock was excavated for the base of the arch. The same earth and rock on which the city of St. Louis had been built some 200 years earlier, where triumphant explorers had once been welcomed and excited settlers prepared for an uncertain journey west. On March 14, 1962, the McDonald Construction Company's low bid of just over $12 million to build the arch was accepted. The first concrete for the arch foundation was poured on the 27th of June of that same year. The footings for the arch were 60 feet deep, sunk 30 feet into bedrock. Into those footings was poured 26,000 tons of concrete. The foundation was critical. It would support a towering monument weighing over 17,000 tons and designed to sway 18 inches. The basic building blocks of the arch were triangular sections. Each wall of these equilateral triangles was a sort of steel sandwich, consisting of a steel inner and outer skin. The inner skin was made of carbon steel. The outer skin, stainless steel, a mere quarter-inch thick. These metal sandwiches were fabricated in huge pieces, some as long as 54 feet, at a steel plant in Pennsylvania. Throughout the entire process, the shiny stainless steel outer surface had to be protected. Once completed, these walls of steel were shipped to the site of the arch to be formed into triangular sections. On February 12, 1963, the first triangular section was placed on the foundation, and the building of the largest stainless steel structure in history had begun.
The men who worked on this, maybe when they started out, they were doubters themselves, or maybe they weren't sure what was going to happen. But I think very quickly they came to realize this was something big. This was something great.
Once each leg reached the 60-foot mark, workers installed creeper derricks, or cranes, on the back of each leg. This ingenious design allowed the cranes to climb up the free-standing legs. As the legs reached higher into the sky, so did the cranes. The machines weighed 100 tons each, and piece by piece raised the 12-foot-high, 50-ton triangular sections into place. Of course, the additional weight of traditional derricks would be too much for the legs of the arch to bear. These derricks needed to be stripped down, with the motors, controls, and even the operators located hundreds of feet below on the ground.
Now, the derrick operator was located in a shack down on the ground, and he couldn't see what was going on at all. He was what you would refer to as a blind derrick operator.
They didn't see a thing. They were sitting inside of a closed area, and they're going 100% of what the guy on the top of the collar is saying on the radio.
Somebody has to tell the operator on the ground what's happening in the air. And the further up you go, the more critical it is.
We had to make a mental picture of what was going on and how close we were, and be real careful that we didn't swing into anybody or hurt anybody.
And this big piece would come up, and then all of a sudden these guys would intercept that. They're scampering around to receive this thing coming in, and there's nothing to catch them if they fell.
It really gets important when you figure you've got 70 or 80 tons hanging over your head and you're standing up there on nothing. Then the guy running the crane really is an important guy. I mean, you want to just go down and kiss him. A lot of people don't realize how scary that is. You know, if you dropped it, you've got nowhere to go.
After each section was put into place, surveyors needed to ensure that it was in exactly the right place. But because the sun heated the legs of the arch during the day and distorted them, the measurements and calculations had to be done at night.
That required the operators to have good eyeballs and to be very patient to make sure that their measurements were accurate.
I can imagine that there was a lot of concern throughout that process to make sure that it didn't start moving out of alignment.
You're building two towers independently of each other and counting on the fact that they're going to meet when they get to the top.
It doesn't take much. If you're traveling that kind of distance and you're off by a fraction of an inch, you could have a very serious problem.
When we would find that the arch was out of where theoretically it should be, then we could tilt that section and move it just 1/8 of an inch or 1/4 of an inch to get it back where we wanted it. And then we could fill it in with weld metal, and then we knew where we were again.
Because the arch relied on the steel plates of its skin for support, the structure had to have the strength of one continuous piece of metal. This required welders who were absolute masters of their trade.
The welding on the arch was difficult, primarily because there could be no flaws whatsoever in those welds.
You have to realize that the arch is not bolted together, it's welded together.
And those welded joints had to be at least as strong as the steel plates in the sections themselves.
The guys would weld 24 hours a day. And when they got done, the guy would come in and x-ray them with an x-ray machine, and if he found one bubble in it, he'd cut the whole thing out.
The task of making hundreds of perfect welds would be challenging enough in the environment of a factory floor. But on the arch, working in the elements, on unlevel surfaces, hundreds of feet in the air, it was unimaginable.
You were not welding straight down. It was horizontal, vertical, or overhead. And under those circumstances, it requires very good techniques. So we went through quite a few welders in the early stages, but once we found men who were capable of doing it, they stayed with us for the entire duration.
After each section was welded into place, it was filled with concrete. This technique was used up to the 300-foot level, after which engineers believed that the strength of the steel would be enough to support the structure. The concrete was pre-stressed, a technique that involved placing steel bars inside the concrete. Once the concrete was set, 18,000 tons of hydraulic pressure was applied to the bars to compress the concrete. The construction project was not without its delays. The arch was built during a time of great changes and unrest in the country, and in the summer of 1964, civil rights activist Percy Green led a protest, climbing the partially completed arch to call attention to unfair hiring practices.
In climbing the arch to protest those labor conditions, I think Percy's work and efforts also brought again to light the fact that in this country founded on principles of democracy and freedom, there were people who still were excluded from that process. And to do that, as he did, certainly made a difference in the employment practices in St. Louis and elsewhere. But it also marked again that time in history when the civil rights movement was bringing heightened awareness to that 3 centuries of exclusion.
In a scene typical of the time, Green was plucked from the arch and arrested. The protest resulted in the first direct actions by the federal government to enforce equal employment opportunities nationwide. There was another problem that summer as well, one so significant that it threatened to leave the arch an unfinished failure. The original plan had been to build the 2 legs of the arch until they nearly met at the top, then to jack the legs apart and carefully drop the final piece into place. Now, George Hartzog, the director of the National Park Service, was being told that the basic design was flawed. When the 2 legs of the arch were jacked apart, engineers argued the steel would buckle. The result could be catastrophic.
At the very beginning, even before we started work, that was a concern of what was going to happen when we jacked the 2 legs apart at the top.
They didn't think it would be able to withstand that pressure.
The main problem was just that people didn't know very much about orthotropic design. And it all depended at that time about which engineer you talked to, the type of answer you would get about whether the arch would succeed or fail.
The National Park Service issued an order not to proceed any further. And for a time, it seemed like this great American monument might instead be a symbol of America's greatest miscalculation. Hartzog turned to his chief engineer, Fred Severud, who disagreed with the others and insisted the plan was sound. Hartzog put his job on the line and made a difficult decision.
George said, I'm going to back what Severud is telling us. And he said, if it falls down, you can fire me. George was an extremely gutsy guy, and he made a lot of gutsy decisions, and this was just one of them.
Some engineers still contended that the arch would buckle. no one would know for certain until the final piece of the arch was in place. Work on the project began again, and the freestanding legs of the arch stretched higher into the sky, testing the strength of the construction and the nerve of the workers.
Back then, safety wasn't a concern it is now. You didn't have to tie off.
We did furnish lanyards if they wanted to tie off, but very few of those men wanted to tie off.
That's just the nature of the business of being an iron worker. You just got a sense when something's safe and when it's not safe.
According to insurance actuaries, building the majestic arch would take the lives of 13 men.
The higher we get, the more wind we'd catch, and the wind was a particular problem to us.
If you were up on the arch and the wind was really blowing, you could actually feel it moving. We were up in a couple of storms, and I guess it moved 12, 14 inches.
Rain made the surfaces slick and then got you wet.
Just about every day you go to work, snow, rain, sleet, just you've got a choice. You can either work or go home. But if you go home, you don't get paid.
At times, they may have looked like children playing with triangular building blocks, except these blocks weighed tons and could easily crush a man or knock him off his precarious perch. Because their very lives were often in the hands of their co-workers, these men built bonds with each other stronger than that of many families.
You get out there and there's nothing to hang on to. You look around and wonder where your buddy is, and he's right there with you. And he's got a hold of your belt and a hold of something that's not going to go down with you. You had to have a lot of trust in your friends or your partners who you worked with.
The men who worked on the inside of the arch faced additional hazards beyond just the height.
It was easy to get disoriented inside. Nothing was horizontal or vertical. You couldn't see the ground, and it was dark and smoky.
You had 25, 30 guys working above you. It's like working at the bottom of a funnel. Everything that's dropped comes right down to you.
It was like a big pachinko machine. You drop one of them big wrenches we use, and it'd rattle all the way down. It bounced back and forth off the walls, the beams, and you'd hear people down below hollering. Naturally, you'd want to try to find something to get your head under and just hope it didn't ricochet sideways and get you.
The thing about dropping something, the guy might be a lot bigger than you are that brings it back up to you.
At 530 feet, with the legs of the arch curving in toward each other, the construction loads, combined with the weight of the derricks, required a brace to be placed between the legs.
The weight of the creeper derricks was hanging over the edge, and that they began to lean toward each other more than we wanted to. So that's when we put in a strut to hold the two legs apart.
High-strength bolts were used to secure the brace in position. Steel harnesses for the brace wrapped around each leg, ensuring that the additional weight would be distributed evenly and transferred directly to the foundation. On October 28, 1965, shimmering in the morning sunlight, a great American monument stood nearly complete. All that remained was to put the final piece in place. It was an occasion not to be missed, and yet Luther Ely Smith and Arro Saarinen were not here this day. Neither man had lived to see this moment. The morning sun was heating the south leg and distorting it out of alignment. So the St. Louis Fire Department used 700 feet of hose to cascade cooling water down the leg. Hydraulic jacks exerting tremendous pressure, 300 tons of it, carefully forced the legs of the arch apart to make way for the final section. This was the moment of truth. Failure now would mean disaster.
The two legs were about 2.5 or 3 feet apart, and we had to jack them apart so that an 8-foot section could be placed in there.
It was the only way with the weight of the 280-ton derricks on top of it. It just had so much pressure on it that it was the only way you could get the last section in.
We had to be very careful that we didn't buckle it by pushing it in the wrong direction or having to push it too far. That complicated the situation.
While helicopters buzzed the arch, snapping pictures of this historic occasion, the Park Service's supervising engineer was also circling the arch, not looking for a photo op, but for signs of buckling, ready at any moment to call a halt to the process.
When we put that last pin in there and had it locked in, I think everybody breathed a sigh of relief. You don't like to be 630 feet in the air with a hydraulic jack.
The controversial technique worked. The distance between the legs had been widened from 2.5 feet to 8 feet. Ready now for the final piece. In a moment of perfect patriotism, Boy Scouts attached an American flag to the final section of the arch just before it started its journey. The trip took 13 minutes, a precious few moments to reflect on what had been accomplished.
Well, I think it represented, in a sense, the last out of a ball game.
It was just amazing to look at, and it all fit. A lot of sweat and blood went into it.
We just didn't realize that so many people from all over the world would be so amazed by its beauty when it was done.
The piece of the arch that put it together was the final part of us grunting and struggling to make the arch go together.
Those of us who were in management, we had an opportunity to say, this is the way we have to do it. But the real heroes are the guys that welded it up, and the ones who were the riggers, the ones who were up there and getting their fingers pinched and sweating. And those are the people that built it.
Those men were celebrated this day, as were the others who had come before them: Jefferson, Lewis and Clark, and the common men, women, and children who first set out from St. Louis into the vast western frontier. Luther Ely Smith recognized their unsung spirit, and Eero Saarinen gave it vision. In many ways, the arch is a reflection of America itself, its past, present, and future. It stands on the banks of the Mississippi as a tribute to the collective dreams that made America what it is and what it will always be. A place where anything is possible, where people are allowed to dream, and the bigger the dream, the better.
I think the arch is a perfect symbol of westward expansion because it's the American spirit of being able to accomplish the impossible.
I think any great work of art, and particularly a great work of architecture, changes the way people see the world. It changes the way people think the world can be. I think when you see some amazing thing somewhere on the landscape that looks nothing like anything that you've ever seen before, you realize that you yourself could make something or do something that nobody's ever done before.
It was a very modern expression of courage and inspiration from the past. A gateway, which is a wonderful symbol. Once you pass through the gate, there's something new on the other side. And that's a wonderful image for all of us, no matter what age.
I don't think it's coincidental, by the way, that St. Louis Arch is built where it is, because in the middle of America, I think people are absolutely open-minded, and I think it's right that that arch is in the center and beams in all directions, because it is something that affirms the impossible, that the impossible is possible.
It's standing for the spirit of the country, the way west, but it's also just a gesture of tremendous energy and ability that represents the country in a way.
It represents that raw past where people came and through sheer force of will, of muscle, they were able to go west and make a living, make something of themselves.
What began at the riverfront is the story, I think, of America itself. That point is not often thought of as this meeting place or melting pot of different races and ethnicities in this country, but it is indeed such a point.
What I always think about when I see the arch are the design issues involved with it, that it is simply a remarkable piece of engineering and a remarkable structure that is really mind-boggling in its simplicity and in its own particular power.
It represents the ingenuity of the American people to envision something important and find a way to make it happen.
You always know when something works, whether it's a piece of music that's perfectly played one time or a clip of a film. You know when it works. Everything comes together, and I think they pulled it off with a piece of architecture this time.